There we go. All right. Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me all right. As usual, just feel free to text into the chat box, and if you're having any trouble or if you have any questions as we go. So it's our last online remote extension meeting for the season. So Dwayne and I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us this season. We, I think, had a pretty successful run, having started in April and had several months of meetings. So we definitely appreciate everyone having filled out our survey so far to date. And if you haven't done it, I sent the link again last night. So please do fill it out. It's helpful for us to get a sense of what was useful in terms of topics, as well as what you might want to see for future. And so we do have funding from Investment Agriculture to resume the meetings again next year. And a couple of you had mentioned perhaps starting earlier in the season, which we would love to do. I know this time of year gets pretty busy. We've got a number of people out spraying, and even some starting with getting ready for harvest. So we would love to do that, and we'd be open to any topics and ideas that you have. So our thanks go out definitely to the BC Fruit Growers Association, as well as Investment Agriculture, for their funding throughout the project. And definitely thanks, Dwayne. It was great to partner with you on this throughout the season. And we look forward to rolling into harvest. So I'll see many of you next week. I think for today, we've got a number of colleagues joining us from the Okanagan, Similkameen, as well as the Creston Valley. So we're very excited to have you join us to listen to Dr. Matt Whiting's talk this morning. So Matt Whiting's joining us from Washington State University. I think you probably don't need a huge introduction, as many of you have met Dr. Whiting over the years. He's been up to speak with us a number of times through the BC Cherry Association and the Horticulture Symposium. But we've invited him today to discuss the UFO planting system, as well as give us some idea of how he has been promoting the system and how we might be able to adapt the system in our area. So I will turn that over to Matt, and we'll let you take it away.
Okay, super. I'll just quickly confirm again, you can hear me okay?
Sounds great.
Awesome, thanks. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Thanks in particular to Molly and also to Dwayne for coordinating this series. I'm really happy to participate. I didn't realize it was the final one for the season. That's exciting. And I hope you guys are looking at a wonderful harvest coming up. We're in almost in the middle of ours in Washington right now. In the Yakima Valley here where I am, we're finished with Bing, pretty much Rainier. We're into sort of earlier, warmer sites even for some lapins right now, and some Skeena will be towards the end of this week. So yeah, we're in full swing, and it's been a very challenging season, as I'm sure you've heard. One of the more unusual ones, I would say, that I've been involved with for almost 20 years with WSU. We had a couple of bad frosts for the first time in several years, and then we've had just a tremendous amount of wind. Actually, the logged wind run has been unusually high this year, and there's a lot of wind damage, and rain. We've had rain every couple of days almost, it seems. So it's been challenging. Packouts are down a bit, but folks are doing their best. Okay, so when Molly invited me, she said there was actually an hour and a half for this. It seems like a long time, but I'm assuming that includes questions and answers and another comment session as well. I've got, I think, somewhere around 45 minutes, let's say. And there's two main topics. The first of which is really breaking down in some detail the architecture of the upright fruiting offshoot system. And then I also want to spend a bit of time sharing with you some of the work that we've done on automation and mechanization, which really goes in part with the concept behind the architecture. UFO and that style of architecture is fine on itself, but when it really shines, I think, is when you're able to also incorporate other technologies, and which was the reason that I brainstormed initially for the system. So let's get into this and with a bit of a more general introduction, and recognizing the fact that as you're looking at new orchards and new plantings, and maybe you travel around the region or the world looking at different orchards, you'll quickly find that cherries are trained to many different systems. And the simple question then was, how would you go about choosing a new system if you're looking at renovations, taking out an old orchard, putting in something new? Rarely have I ever seen anybody do the same thing, right? So you're not taking out a 16 by 20 block and putting in a 16 by 20 block. So it's a tough question sometimes. And so how you choose? Well, you look at what's available. What information is there? What are your neighbors doing? What do you have success with personally and see as a vision for the future? With some colleagues at Oregon State and Michigan State, we published this manual on cherry training systems in 2015. It could be useful. It is available online, by the way, for free, or you can actually get it as an app on your iPad or your phone, and it goes through step by step for many different training systems. In fact, we cover 7 different systems in this manual. And if you just did a quick Google search for, I'm gonna move this toolbar on my computer. If you did a quick, I think it's 667 or PNW 667 cherry training systems, you'd find that pretty quickly. But it goes through all of these systems, right? Spanish bush, Kim Green bush, steep leader, TSA, the tall spindle axe, the central leader. So there's sort of these 2 central leader systems, neither of which is exactly like what a lot of growers in BC grow. And then there's the SSA, and the UFO is in there as well. So I like to think about the general factors, though, as one would be making a decision that you should be thinking about in choosing a training system. And they are based sometimes in the physiology, and that's fundamental with light interception and light distribution. So as a professor, I'm often reminding students about the fundamental importance of light, and the same thing for orchardists. Light is the most important input to any orchard, and it's still free. So you've got to maximize the interception and optimize the distribution of the light in that system. So think about that. Spacing, of course, is important. How you prune and train and manipulate the growth to accomplish a high light distribution. Clearly, typically foremost on people's minds is the yield and the quality of fruit. And when I've talked to growers in the Northwest, they've said, well, Matt, if you're doing training systems trials, really the only number that we want to know is the yield of the highest quality of fruit. So tell us, what was the yield of 9-row and larger per acre? I mean, that in a lot of ways, that it becomes the most important information. Less so actually what it took to get there, but really just about those numbers. So quantity and quality of fruit are supremely important, of course. But not only that, I'd like to remind folks to think about the uniformity of the fruit. And I'm just showing you one quick example here of in 2016, how we went into, this was a steep leader block. This is just data from a couple of trees on the distribution of fruit color, right? Using the CT IFL color cards. So it ranged from a 3 up to a 7. So a 3 would be quite light. Typically where we want to be in the 5 to 6 range, depending on the market destination. But I just wanted to show you here how in dormant season, we changed the pruning quite a bit to focus on distribution of light. And you can see how in the subsequent season, we're able to concentrate the color classes, right? And shift it to a peak right on 6 and very little color classes on either side. So the uniformity of fruit is impacted absolutely by the training system, and through the light distribution, light interception, and the bearing surface where your wood is. Production efficiency is also important, and that's most important for harvest. And I will share with you later this morning some data where we've been looking at this specifically and putting some numbers to the effects of training system, but also production efficiency and pruning. And that's one of the fundamental goals behind the development of the UFO system, would be to simplify the pruning and training process. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail too. Environmental footprint is something that's not so empirical. It's difficult to quantify that, but we are concerned about minimizing drift and minimizing inputs and maximizing the efficiency of inputs, including water and labor and pesticides. Labor requirements and the safety Labor safety in blocks is important. This was a major driver behind, in addition to efficiencies, but a driver behind moving to pedestrian architectures and trying to limit the use of ladders in orchards for operations. And lastly, and this one actually has emerged in my program to be one of the most important, and that's the ability of an orchard architecture or a system to adopt and utilize mechanization or automations, including those that are currently available and those that would be available into the future. So the good news is, if you think about all of those things, it's a lot to consider in looking at a training system, and it's not an exhaustive list. After almost 20 years at WSU, I've come up with this process that's going to simplify the training system selection. So you put in a few inputs and it will determine what's the best training system for your orchard. It looks a little bit like this. So obviously this is, I'm being facetious here. This is a complicated interaction of actually things not at all related to training systems or tree fruit, but I did like just the fact that it's overwhelmingly complicated and shows all these ridiculous interrelationships. And yet, in terms of a mind map, I mean, your thought process in coming up with a training system could look something like that, considering these major factors you've gone through. All right, so when you think about Washington alone, this is a number that I came up with. And it goes to the point of the ability to incorporate automation and high labor efficiency with your systems. There are 22, roughly, give or take a few, 22 billion sweet cherries that need to be harvested in Washington State every year. We've had a fairly stable production level over the last 3 or 4 years. This year will be down a little bit, but that's based on boxes and tonnage and acreage, and so that's about 220 million kilos of cherries. And based on data that we've generated on average picking speed, that would take one person a little over 7 million hours to harvest all those fruit if one person could. And that would be nearly 100,000 days or 2,500 years for one person to pick all of Washington's cherry crop in one season. And so if you calculate that down further, it comes out to being about 30,000 people are required to harvest the cherries if we assume about a 6-week harvest window at average speed. So there's a lot of fruit, there's a lot of people involved with it. And this actually was a major concern when I started at WSU, that, we were transitioning to dwarfing rootstocks, new architectures, increasing cherry plantings a lot, very profitable. And the concern was over labor being secured for harvest. More recently, we've heard about modern orchards should be ready for robots. This is from a trade journal. Another photo from the Australian newspaper saying robot ready, 2-dimensional orchards with this grower of the year there. That's from a few years ago even. That's of course apples. Another one from New Zealand talking about the same thing. Are we ready for automation? How do we transition to these planar architectures and get robots into our orchards? There actually is a commercially available robot that works in vineyards. That's called the Wall Yi down there in the bottom left. It'll go through and do some sucker pruning. And in the bottom right now, you see the actuator or the vacuum head from the robotic harvester that's been tested commercially in this past season for apple harvest. So there is this push. It's extraordinary transition from the 20 by 20 blocks now to saying our orchards of the future must be ready for robots and 2-dimensional. And so when you look at this, and this was actually just from last winter, by the way, this isn't an archival photo, and not very far from my research farm either. So this is probably somebody who didn't attend a lot of my field days. They're still doing these, but a classic 20 by 20 architecture, and it's clearly not ready, not robot ready, and one would struggle even to say that it's ready for humans in there and going through the pruning processes and harvesting processes. So one of the main goals then of my research program over the years is to improve orchard efficiencies and ultimately really it's orchard profitability through adoption and innovations of orchard systems. And that's based on fundamental physiology. It's based on a focus on labor efficiencies. And again, some of those things I mentioned, including incorporating automation and mechanization. And so that's a simple contrast in these last two photos from really the major system for a long period of time was this steep leader architecture, right? All over Washington State and quite a bit in Oregon. Less, of course, I think in your area, but this was the popular system. 3 liters, horizontal weaker fruiting wood, cleaning up and opening up the centers. And so this might be a 10 by 16, 10 by 18 type of a spacing, typically with a mazzard rootstock. And now this is where we have been transitioning. A lot of growers going to this Tatura style V architecture with 6 or 7 horizontal planes of fruiting wood. This happens to be early robin on Gisela 12, a little bit north of the Tri-Cities. So back to this question then of what training system to use. And I just like to think about it in 2 general ways. The first of which is an establishment phase, and that is related to how easy is it, or how quickly trees can fill the space. What are the costs involved with pruning and training and just sort of general manipulations to the tree? And then how does that translate into precocity, right? So how quickly can you get fruiting? How quickly can you fill the space? And those are really textbook fundamentals of pomology from years ago, of saying, fill the space, transition into fruiting quickly, recover your investment as basic goals. And then there's after that, what do you do? How do you manage? And these are some of the key factors that I think that you need to think about. We don't talk a lot about managing the tops, but right, trees will reach their maximum height and within short order. And then how do you manage the tops of those trees? What about renewal pruning? How do you recycle out old fruiting wood and regenerate new productive fruiting wood? And then how sustainable is it? How do you ensure that year after year there is consistency and sustainable fruiting? So those, again, these are very general terms, but things to think about for future training systems. And let me just quickly contrast this image on the right. Some of you have probably seen trees something like that. Actually, it's not all that different from the common central leader over on the western areas of BC in the Okanagan. It's different, but not terribly. This, of course, is more like a Solax system, and this was taken in Spain, but I could have taken the photo in many places in Chile as well. Very common architecture. This unheaded pole, central axe, a lot of scoring and promelin to induce these lateral breaks that then you can't see it so much from this photo, but a tremendous amount of string in here. In fact, they actually do have wires, a trellis system running through here just to attach the strings to, and to get this flatter angles. And this photo actually I took 2.5 years ago. And in that same month, in my travels, I took this photo, which is another significant investment. You can see the trellis in here as well, plus the covers. And those 2 architectures really couldn't be more different, right? They're growing sort of a hybrid between a KGB and a more traditional Spanish bush architecture, but that bush type system, starting very low, trying to have a pedestrian block. And you can see that they're fruiting now off spur wood on vertical wood. And in the previous situation, there's a permanent vertical structure with all this horizontal wood that's renewable and replaceable. And yet those were similar age. Actually, I neglected to point out, you see the covers in here as well. So a tremendous investment in system and structure, and so completely different. So just to point out the fact that cherries there's no system, let's say, for cherries that works for all, and many people around the world are trying all kinds of different approaches. So that first component that I mentioned was the establishment, the ease and the cost and the precocity. And this is just one fairly stark example, a photo that a friend and colleague from Chile took on her travels in California. This is one of their colleagues in the photo here. These folks in California set up a systems trial of their own where they were comparing the same genotype, but doing the KGB system in the portion of this row, and then a vertical wall of UFO in the neighboring rows. And you can see in the UFO, they were doing the split system, which is sending 1 leader to one side and 1 leader to the other side in the UFO. And so when you look at these trees planted the same day, there is a tremendous effective orchard system on precocity. And maybe it's not fair to compare UFO to KGB on this principle of precocity, because they're probably the 2 most extremes in terms of how precocious they could be. KGB being not particularly precocious, and UFO should be among the most precocious of architectures. So one of the things that I did when looking at all these complicated structures and processes was to look at what's been successful in other crops. And mostly I looked at apples in Washington, because it is the #1 agricultural commodity, and they've had the luxury of size controlling rootstocks for a lot longer. And so their orchard systems have transitioned in following the similar pressures that cherry growers face. And this is a very common system. A vertical wall, it could be 9 feet between rows, it's more likely 10, 7, in some cases 6, in some cases 8 of these tiers of horizontal fruiting wood based off of a central axe. But there's fundamentals, though, to this structure, and that it is a very compact fruiting wall. This obviously leads to high input efficiency, and that's true for all inputs, I would suggest. It also creates a system with predictable fruiting and vigor, and this comes from precision orchard management. So well-trained people, and not even so well-trained people, can work in a block like this because of the consistencies among trees and along rows and block to block. So it becomes simpler to train, and it becomes a highly efficient structure. So we began trying to do the same thing, basically copying what was done with apples in cherries in some ways, a slightly different approach due to differences in fruiting and bearing habit. But this is actually our first, and I should have updated the age on this slide. This is our first commercial partner on the UFO. And actually now it is 13 years old, not 10, so I apologize for that. And this was a block that was being planted to a central leader, Tieton, on Gisela 5. And I was visiting with the manager as they were doing this, and I was able to convince him to put in a couple of acres transition to the UFO. And so they headed their trees that were going to be central leader, and then they trained 2 leaders horizontally. And you can see that in this tree in the foreground here, where one, sometimes they're referred to as cordons, like the vertical shoot positioning in grape, one up the north side of the row and one down towards the south end of the row, and then the upright fruiting wood off of that. And actually, even though we've got a fair bit of time, can't get into all the information here, this has been their most profitable block over the years, despite the fact that it's Tieton, which is a cultivar that's sort of fallen out of favor and not especially productive. So they're happy with 4.5, 5.5 tons would be pretty good for Tieton. And we've actually got a lot of great data that compares and contrasts this UFO system with and it's completely adjacent and contiguous, their central leader, which was planted again the same day. So we've done a lot of studies in that orchard, and I got a lot of good numbers on harvest efficiencies and productions. It looks very similar to this, right? For those of you who read The Good Fruit Grower, this was, I don't know, within the last year, they had published this article on this, quote, super orchard, this new idea, I'm saying it's not new, for apples and how they should be growing apples. This is an idea coming out of New Zealand from researchers who have been here and seen the way that we're doing this. So it's being applied, the concept, at least is being applied in apples as well. And actually I've seen really spectacular UFO trained plum blocks, apricot, and now we're working with some guys locally to grow pears as well. Here's an image of early robin on Gisela 12. This is a 12-foot spacing between the rows. Wide trellised and 4-foot between the rows. Gives you a nice image there of the potential of the consistency of the fruiting from top to bottom in a block like that. So, and this photo actually is that same orchard just in flower. We've come back to the same process and thought of high light interception, good light distribution, compact fruiting walls that lend themselves to precision orchard management, repeated processes down the row, high production efficiency, and an orchard like this, as I'll demonstrate a little bit later, we think is very suitable for mechanization or automation. I wanted to just maybe take a quick pause here and see if there were any questions or comments at this stage. I gotta change my view here. So I'm not hearing anything, right? So keep going.
Hold on, Matt, just a sec here.
Yeah, I can't see the chat section when I have my full screen, so I don't know if there has been a question.
There's a question coming in from Lynn. The question is there any economic information available with respect to the cost of establishing the plantings?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the short answer is no, that we haven't done any large scale studies of the economics. I can share with you just from my many conversations with growers over the years and at field days, what the kinds of numbers that I have heard. It has ranged from about $12,000, $13,000 an acre. And when I say this number that I'm mentioning is the costs to establish, which is your trees, trellis, irrigation, labor that went into it all. And I've heard numbers that are closer to 20,000. So there would be several factors that would influence that. I think the guys that, in fact, this block that you see here, they are very well versed in installing trellis. They've got this curved hoop pre-assembled trellis, and that saves them money. They've got crews that are very good at doing this, and planting machines as well for putting out multiple rows in one pass. So the higher end would be about 20,000 per acre. And again, maybe the lower numbers that I've heard of them in the 12 to 13,000.
Great, thanks, Matt. Are there any other questions, or we'll let Matt continue? You can feel free to text them into the chat box and I'll read them out, or I think that's probably easier than unmute yourselves.
Yeah, and so on my screen, when I do the full screen, then I can't see the chat. So Molly, feel free just to unmute and say just a second, because it might be simpler. Well, if you're looking at something or you want to go back just one slide, I'm happy to do that and just interrupt as much as you like. Okay. By the way, for apple systems, I talked to these same guys who have apples, and their costs per acre that they figure, it's a bit conservative, a bit high, is in the $45,000 to $47,000 per acre now to stamp out a high density apple block.
Matt, we've got one more question that is asking whether or not these blocks of cherries, like the one in the image, have to be thinned.
Yeah, definitely. I'll get into that too. Yeah, so this was sort of a transition from more general comments on what to think about. Now we're going to get into the details of the UFO specifically, and then I'll finish with some of these technologies, and one of them will be thinning. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't get into that in too much detail, but let me just say here that when I started here and we were looking at these new rootstocks that were dwarfing and precocious like Gisela, and now we've got some Krimsk options and others that we were saying, you've got to tip everything. You know, for most other systems, we were saying tip everything to remove that high density of buds and spurs at the end of annual growth. encourage more leaf area to support the remaining fruit. These are the philosophies in general for these rootstocks. And now we're saying, hey, wait a minute, don't do that. Grow these vertical poles without the lateral wood that would provide all that leaf area to support these. And so the major question was exactly that, about, well, what in the world are we doing for crop load management? And for those of you actually who do grow, if anybody grows early robin, you might be familiar with this type of a photo. Absolutely snowball, glorious bloom, thick, but very low fruit set, right? So in this particular block, they've had 6 to 7 tons per acre, even though you look at that photo and there's the potential in there for 20 tons an acre. But crop load management has been an important issue. I'll get into that briefly. So let's get into this a little bit more detail. Try to bring up the laser pointer again. I lost that. Yeah, okay. All right, so I'll just go through a little bit more details here from practical levels of what to do and what the goals are. The first year with this system is the goals are to try to fill the space between trees. So in this case, from this tree to the neighboring tree, and in some cases that's readily accomplished. If you're, I've given some ideas here for tree spacing on a few different rootstocks. The first number is down the row, and then the second number is between the rows. So I'm suggesting on Gisela 5, you could go 1 meter down the row to perhaps 2 meters, although it would be an extraordinary situation if you were going to plant, I think, Gisela 5 2 meters apart down the row. And then this number on the left would be for a vertical fruiting wall, and this number on the right would be for a wide trellis. So we're going to space those further apart, of course, and 5 meters would be extremely far apart for a wide trellis on Gisela 5. But just to give you an idea of the ranges that I would expect. One other point that I will make here, that all this conversation is really going to be about this style of UFO planting, which is the single unbranched whip oriented at about 45 degrees. If you have extraordinarily vigorous site, then that's the only exception where I would actually recommend planting the tree vertical, heading it, and then bringing one cord onto one side and one to the other side. I've seen some examples in Chile where they planted trees 7, even 8 feet apart down the row and utilized this process, which is what we had recommended. And then you end up just getting too far from the root system, too far down down the line, and you lose uniformity in the uprights when you get too far. So my general recommendation for a cutoff there is somewhere about 6 feet. If you feel like you need to space the trees more than 6 feet, you should probably think about doing the split system instead of the single tree. So the illustrations here will be largely for that single tree style. So the goal is to fill that space and really to get new uprights. So your future fruiting wood of about 3/4 to a meter, and you want to have those spaced at about 15 to 20 centimeters apart on the we'll call it the cordon. And so how do you do that? Well, planting unheaded whips. And this was also one of the reasons that came up with this structure, was so many times we would see people planting these $10, $11, $12 trees and then cutting off 2/3 of that tree to begin. And so we wanted to try to take advantage of what was delivered and what could be delivered. Typically nurseries will head the nursery stock for transport. And so if one were considering the UFO system, that's usually the first conversation you have. Can you deliver unheaded material? And how tall would the trees be? And that'll depend on your rootstock and the nursery and a few other things, but they do need to know. We've had a couple of disappointed growers who didn't do that. They didn't tell the nursery that they were planting for the UFO, and so they got the trees all headed at about 4.5 feet, and they just do that so they can put them into the bins for delivery. So you don't want that. You want that full tree. So that'd be the first thing to do, and we have recommended planting at about 45 degrees. the angle isn't all that important. We've seen them quite a bit lower than that. I think the only challenge you'd have is if you plant them a little bit more upright than that and trying to get them horizontal. So somewhere about 45. You don't need to get out there with a protractor and measure each tree. And then the second step is to remove the buds below the wire. Typically this wire is at about 20 inches, maybe 22 inches. And then we have found that just manually rubbing off those buds is an important first step, because there would never be a case of where you'd want to have a new shoot beginning from below the wire, unless you were splitting the trees. But as I'm illustrating it here, you wouldn't do that. So this section should be eliminated from future spurs, and just by removing those buds. So just an example, this is actually a research block that we planted 7 years ago, and actually it's 1 meter between the trees, and we've got 4 meters between the rows. This one we trained to a Y trellis, which we trained it for mechanical harvest. But in this case, you can see how we've essentially sort of filled the tree to tree space down the row, and more than that, they're in fact overlapped at the point of harvest, because we were planting a little bit over 2 meter tall trees and putting them a meter apart at about this 45. And you can see that we haven't got the trellis in here yet. That came in pretty shortly hereafter, but this is how the block looked like. I see there's one tree here where you can see a lateral limb on here, and maybe there's another one here. If your trees do come with lateral branching, take it out. We've never seen a case of where that's going to help. Typically, it'll divert and become the main leader after you've oriented these trees to the angle. So in fact, we don't want feathered trees for the situation. The only exception to that might be where your feathers or your lateral branches actually are at the terminal end, and that would be very unusual, right? So typically you might have a few laterals towards the base of the tree or the midsection of the tree, and those are undesirable. You definitely don't want those. So prune those out completely. Don't stub them back to get renewal, just prune them out completely. So we do recommend to, at least in the northern hemisphere, point the trees south, because we have seen cases where there's been sunburn in that first year or two, right? So if we oriented our trees to the north, you would be exposing this portion of the trunk in that, really in that first and second winter, to the potential for some sunburn and even some cold damage. So it's a subtle maneuver, but I think pointing the trees to the south, and you could even paint the trunks white, as if you've indicated here, to help protect from that. If that's not a big pressure in your area, then you wouldn't have to worry about it too much. In the case of where there's a slope, I've had this question. So, well, actually, my slope goes to the south. Should I point them all downhill? And in that case, no. If you have a slope that does angle to the south, you're better off than pointing the trees uphill rather than downhill. Just another example of a block where they had the trellis in place first. So this was a vertical block that had 10 feet between the rows, and they were planting the trees 6 feet apart down the row. This is early robin on Gisela 12. And I've also illustrated here where they've done the classic of just one tie. In this case, they use these sort of rubber ties. We've also used those sort of shovel head rubber clips that you just wrap around and they self-cinch. There are various techniques to do that. I do recommend using something that's flexible, though, that has some give in it, like those rubber, rather than a metal clip. And I'll explain why, I think, in a little bit later. And so the other thing to point out here is you want to remove all of these buds down below that first wire. And their wire in here was at about 22 inches again. And you just rub those buds off. And that's it. You plant the trees on that angle. They're pointed south. They've got one clip on here. Any large branching, in fact, hard to tell in the photo, they might have missed a few, but you take off any lateral branches at this stage as well. And that's pretty much it for the planting process. So again, your goal is to fill the space between the trees and get new upright growth that's about 15 to 20 centimeters apart. And so the next step then, as you get into the season, is to leave these trees at this angle until the new shoots, and this isn't a hard, fast rule, but I would say are at least a foot or 35 or more centimeters long, right? So that's saying that, and actually, now that I look at it again, I see that the illustrations, we should have removed these spur wood from below the wire. But you really want this new shoot growth at the terminal end, and you leave these trees at this angle until you've got that new growth. This was something that was a subtle change that's made a world of difference, though. When we first were coming up with the idea, I thought we should just plant these trees and then clip the whip to the wire horizontally at the point of planting. And any of you who have tried this would know immediately what the problem was. We ended up getting too much vigorous growth right at the point of that curve at the wire. And so we were getting vigorous shoots at this point and not getting the growth at the terminal end. It was difficult then to shift the vigor to the terminal end later, if not impossible. So now what we've learned is leave these trees like this. Let them get good growth, give the terminal end a good head start. And once you've got a good head start in here, later in the season, before this becomes too stiff, so there's a window of opportunity there, then you bring this leader down then to the wire. Yep. So keeping vigor at the terminal end is really, really important in the first year. So it may look something like that, different shoots in different directions. That doesn't matter so much. Once you bring them down to the wire, you'll decide which of these you're going to keep and which you're going to clip out. So this is what that previous block looked like, probably 6-7 weeks into the season. So they're getting good growth at the terminal end, and they've left them at this angle, right? It looks a little bit funny at this stage, but that's the first step. And they've actually put these trunk protectors on each tree as well, which is another approach that you can do. And then once we've got these new shoots, you can see more in the background here, we're probably more like 45, 50, 60 centimeter long shoots. Then I'm showing here where I've taken off that clip. So I've taken the clip off here, and then I'm taking the tree down. I'm going to reposition that clip right here. So sometimes that works. Some growers do that, and some will just add a second clip to the tree. But the problem, or the potential problem with adding a second clip, so in other words, if I left this clip on the tree here and then just pulled this branch down and put a second clip further along, sometimes you end up with a hump in the leader here, or right at this point, right? So you've got a clip here, it goes up, and then you bring it back down, and that's not good. That's not desirable. I'd much rather have this situation where it goes a little bit flatter and then but maintains this upward angle at all times, that it never goes below horizontal in its angle. So you'll have to decide what would be the best process if you're thinking about trying that. There's various ways, but we have found that it works pretty well to just remove that clip, move it down, not to the end, but close to the end. And then as I'm showing here, we want to actually keep that terminal shoot going vertical. We don't want to bring the entire tree horizontal. We want to keep that terminal end vertical. And this is actually a photo that Molly shared the other day of a block, I believe it's in your area, of that first year. So you got great spur growth actually right on this nursery stock wood. It's 1-year-old non-fruiting spur wood down here, and you've got the new shoot growth. So this would be too early to bring it horizontal because you haven't got the extension growth yet at the terminal end. But what is good to see across all of these trees is that there are strong shoots pushing at that terminal end, right? So the next step then is to later in the year, when these have extended, is to bring then this down onto the first wire. That's in this case isn't there yet, but you bring it down to that wire. The other point, critical point, is to remove any of these shoots near the basal end of the tree. So in this photo that Molly sent, there's at least 2 that I can see. Oh, there's a third here. You've got to go through, and I would suggest at least 2 passes in that first year of just walking along and finding these shoots that are starting to grow near the basal portion of that tree and taking them out. Because if they get started in the first year, they become dominant. And I've seen many examples of a grower not being prudent with removing these, and then they become dominant shoots, and it's very difficult to back away from that and get the vigor back at the terminal end. By getting it in the terminal end the first year, it really improves uniformity into the second year. So by the end of that first year, you really want something like this, right? With moderate, well-bent growth of these uprights. What I've pointed here is to eliminate the excessively vigorous uprights in the basal portion, right? So anything growing down towards the bottom of the tree has to be taken out. You've got to also tie those uprights if they're sufficiently long to that next wire, just to get them in position after that first year. So the keys again, vigorous growth at the terminal end and no uprights near the base. Now what I've also shown here is that curve, and this is a subtle point, but it is important that you have this gentle curve and to a horizontal, and maintaining the terminal end being vertical. Some cases we've seen growers do exactly as illustrated here, take a shoot and actually just tie it up ahead because they want it to fill the space and to grow vertically rather than let it go horizontally. Now, the benefit, of course, of using this type of an architecture with these precocious rootstocks is that in the second year, this column, right, that nursery tree that you didn't cut back will be fruiting. So there is that tremendous potential for fruiting even in the second year. And the promotion of uprights in the first year, all of this wood here becomes fruiting potential in year 3. So the more uprights you generate in that first year, the more precocity and fruiting you're going to have in the third year. And that's just a reminder again of the precocity. When you get those vertical shoots, this is maybe even excessively vigorous, but this is all fruiting wood now in the subsequent season on that wall in California. And just another example here along the, this is our wide trellised orchard where we're starting to take those new shoots and send them to the east and west sides of the row. But you can see that nursery piece of wood now is flowering and will be fruiting the second year. And just in general, with numbers that we've collected from working with growers, we've seen them in the range of 1 to 2 tons per hectare in the second leaf, just harvesting along that column. And a really common question is, should we allow that to happen, or should we remove those flowers and favor the establishment and growth of the uprights? And there's no easy answer for that. It really depends on several factors. I have seen a case where if the grower decided to leave all of this fruit and pick it, that it did hurt the establishment of the canopy. And that would have been a situation probably with the higher tonnage. And I've seen many cases where it hasn't, where there's good vigor, you got a good balance, you're still pushing a lot of new shoots in those trees, and then you can support both. And it would depend on your situation, whether it would be advisable to harvest in the second leaf or not. And this is typically, I only had this older photo. This is typically what we see. This is actually this is the same orchard here that you see, the next year here. So we got that initial growth at the terminal end of this tree, right? There's a nice slow curve to a horizontal, and then the terminal end, you can't see it now, but what goes up here as the next tree is right here. Yeah, and so there were no buds that had broken on the basal portion of that tree because we just had the terminal ends, and we removed the buds at the basal portion. And now you can see though in that second season how we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 good shoots in these lower portions that broke in the second year. I've worked with a lot of growers over the years who've done this system, and after year 1, sometimes they're a little bit frustrated. They say, well, we've just got 3, 4 shoots on every tree at the terminal end. There's nothing below it. I'm worried that they're not going to break. And then typically this is what happens. Excuse me. And that evens out. So we've given the terminal end of the tree the head start. And then this new growth towards the basal portion fills in and it really evens out and you get great uniformity of the uprights. And this happens without the need for scoring or any promoline in this portion of the wood, okay? I get that question a lot too, and I had a master's student who we looked at all kinds of different treatments and bud break percentages, and without any treatment at all, we were in the 70 to 90% of those spurs and broke into new shoots in that second year. So we've also had questions over the years about damage to wood and wires, and this is not so much from the Pacific Northwest, where our climate isn't so bad for wood and wire combinations. But this is one solution that I thought was innovative that a grower had done, taken some old tubing and just put it at that junction. So where the main trunk was going to reach the wire, just to put on the piece of tubing there. And this also shows you that some of you are familiar with this, I'm sure, that rubbery material that's used to make that initial tie. But it also shows you how they should have taken out these spurs below that wire too. So now that we've got the system started and got the terminal end with a good head start, this is, once you get into maintenance mode, really, these are the simple pruning rules. The first one that we recommend is to renew the largest uprights, and that's illustrated all the way over here on the left with these larger stub cuts. I'll get into that in a bit more detail in a moment. And then the second rule is to remove all lateral wood. And we also recommend with stub cuts, leaving a short piece on the tree. And that's illustrated throughout here, so that anything growing laterally is cut back. And this gets to the core of the pruning philosophy and the simplification of pruning. There's really no reason that you couldn't come up with a very simple rule and somebody is responsible, or a crew is responsible for taking out these largest uprights. So there's just walking down the road, finding in each tree the largest, or maybe you've got a threshold. If anything's larger than a particular size, it comes out. And then another crew following behind, just taking out anything growing laterally. And in fact, I share this story all the time about a high school kid who was working for me about 5 years ago, and I had him prune our UFO blocks up at the research farm. He had never pruned a tree before in his life. And yet, because of the simplified rules, I was able to tell him, look for this and do this. And yeah, he made a few mistakes, but for the most part, he was able to prune that orchard without any difficulty. And so this is what it would look like in the midsummer if we've accomplished that proper spacing. This is probably a little bit more than 20 centimeters here and probably about 20 centimeters here. Really what I look for is that spacing of the leaves, so that there's very little overlap. And then on the new shoots, then as you go below and you get into the spur wood, we'd like to keep a small column between those for light, so that we don't create a fully compact and full wall of shade in the structure, that we are able to keep some channels of light moving from the east to west across the orchard. Just a bit more about this renewal process. In terms of when do you do the renewal, I mentioned you want to remove the vigorous shoots in the first year. So those are not to be renewed. They're to be taken out if they're at the basal portions of the tree. After that, if you do find vigorous shoots, they need to be renewed. So in a sense, you could get into this renewal process even in the second and certainly by the third leaf. You should be taking out the most vigorous shoots. That comes at a little bit of the cost of precocity, but we've seen that in the long term to get uniformity of uprights. That's really important. And this is an example here of where there was in the early years, probably the second or third leaf, we had a vigorous shoot and we cut it out, and now we've got two more shoots where we've just diluted that vigor. And this is an example on the right of where we've gone into an older block, found the most vigorous and probably a 5 or 6 year old upright here, cut it out, and we've generated those new shoots, those new renewal shoots. That is a very similar process to the KGB. For those of you who are familiar with renewal in KGB, it's not really a different philosophy or process behind it. And one of the reasons that I like it a lot is because it takes advantage of the ways that cherries like to grow, for the most part. Now, there are exceptions, but most cherry cultivars are fairly vigorous and upright and growing. And so This is one of my main objections to the Tatura system, for example, is the renewal process isn't so intuitive, and it's difficult to renew and then keep renewing and tying to horizontal positions. We like to take advantage of the way that the trees grow naturally. So I did have a student who was working on this, and we did a 2-year study in I believe it was 4 different commercial orchards of UFO, where we looked at the timing of pruning and the type of pruning. And the timing was fully dormant. We compared with a full bloom cut compared with a post-harvest cut for renewal. And the type of cut was illustrated here on the left, where we pruned back to leave 1 or 2 spurs or live positions for regrowth. So that required a little bit more thinking, right? So you identified this is the largest one, it has to come out, and we found 1 or 2 spurs, left those, and cut just above them. Another one was a flush cut, where we brought the upright back very close to the point of origin. So no regard to whether or not there was a point for regrowth. And that was actually suggested by a grower who was doing this on his own and said that works well for him. And then the other one was, well, what if you just told someone to go through and 10 centimeters above the main leader, just cut it back. And so pay no attention to whether there was a point for regrowth or not. And so it looks something like this. So we collected a lot of data over the years in these cultivars. And in summary, what we found was the best time or type is full bloom, and when we were able to leave 1 or 2 nodes. So sometimes you might have a cut that's actually less than 10 centimeters because you've got a couple of spurs down here, or you might have one, in this case, it's longer than 10 centimeters because you had to go a little bit higher in order to leave a point for regrowth. We found that full bloom renewal cuts were more effective than fully dormant cuts by about 10–15%. So when we did these cuts in full bloom to the most vigorous upright and left options for regrowth, we were getting greater than 90% regrowth or new shoots generated from those cuts. The worst case scenario was the post-harvest cut. But this can be a useful cut to take out a larger, more vigorous upright after harvest if you do not want a renewal. So when you just want to thin out the uprights, if you've got too many, in that situation, post-harvest is a good time to make the cuts. And this is what it looked like when the grower was doing these flush cuts, which was intriguing to us. And this will depend on the vigor of your site, but this was a fairly vigorous site. And where we cut them back, this was exactly what the grower described, that he's getting an adventitious new shoot, new bud break, just at different points, typically like this, just below where that larger piece was taken out. But that's a beautiful renewal shoot that will grow and fill up that space quite quickly. The other question of when to renew is not so much about what time of year, but what age of wood. You get that question a lot too. So can we have a 10-year-old upright in the UFO system? And the answer is yes, provided that it still has healthy spur wood. So typically the time to renew an upright is when you lose the spurs to shoots. Right? So this is a typical fruiting spur that we'd like to see on upright wood in the UFO system. And when we lose these spurs to breaking into shoots, you've lost that spur wood, right? And so that's typically when it's time to renew, when you've lost a lot of your spur wood and you find yourself tipping back a lot of these 1-year-old shoots. And so clearly the upright has lost its fruiting potential or minimized its fruiting potential. There's one exception, and that's where you actually have a cultivar that like a Regina, where it has a lot of or even Tieton, less of a spur type and more lateral shoot habit. And in that case, we've modified the UFO rules to space your uprights out further and actually farm the horizontal wood in almost an SSA-like style, where you take this horizontal branch and we cut it back to a vegetative bud and we capture the fruit at the base, and then you do the same thing year after year. So that's a slightly different process, but that can be done too. So these are not UFO orchards, but just dormant photos to illustrate when it would be useful if your uprights in a UFO look like this, or certainly if they look like this, right? No more spur wood, all lateral shoots. So you could fruit those for a year by cutting all of these lateral shoots back to a vegetative node, getting all the fruit at the base of those shoots, but then it's really no longer productive, and those would have to be taken out. This, of course, is actually a block that the grower was setting up for a Tsatsura, where they took that wood and were doing the scoring and pruning to get horizontal fruiting wood. One of the other questions that we've had come up over the years is, well, what if we have these excessively vigorous uprights? Can we actually try to control them, keep them in place and fruit them rather than taking them out? So we've more recently set up a few trials where we're looking at these different ideas. And one that I'm illustrating here is this deep scoring. This was a grower idea saying, well, let's really cut into this wood with a pruning saw, a third, in this case, almost half of the way through the wood, and see if that will control the vigor and maybe even improve the fruiting. We've also looked at the use of apogee, sort of spot applications of apogee to the terminals of these more vigorous uprights to see if we can slow them down. Maybe if I join you guys next year, I can share with you what we've found there. I want to briefly talk about pruning the tops now, because this is often overlooked when you think about training systems. We had another trial where we were looking at in a larger commercial block of UFO. We were comparing the dormant heading cuts to the tops of trees. In this case, you can see the contrast with the excuse me, the post-harvest heading cut. This is fairly intuitive, I'm sure, for you, but it really illustrates a key point, that we do not recommend dormant topping in the UFO architecture. When you filled the space, truly the best time to manage that is with a post-harvest heading cut. When you get very little, in this case, you're looking at 4 to 6, maybe this one 8 inches of regrowth. Now, in the dormant season, you could come in and thin these out, right? You could prune all of these out and leave perhaps just this one, the more vertical position, or a weaker one. But this is a far better situation to deal with than this situation on the left. So the dormant pruning cuts, they do two things. And it's illustrated actually, both of them in this photo. It invigorates clearly that point for growth, which creates a larger shade structure with all this new active shoot growth at the top, but you also lose those spurs, right? You can see that here where the spur wood is turned into shoots as well because of the local invigoration, and you don't see that with the post-harvest. You've still got good spurs up here at the top. And then a dormant thinning cut is not really recommended either, because that just simply re-emphasizes in growth, and you start to get larger caliper wood at the tops of the trees. So that's not an appropriate process either. So what we're saying here is that post-harvest heading is really a good approach for managing the tops of trees in the UFO architecture. All right, so just a bit of a summary then on the system itself. Unfeathered trees, unheaded trees, planted at about this 45-degree angle. One clip usually is sufficient to a wire at about 50 centimeters. Later in the season, you're going to train that trunk horizontally when you've got good growth at the terminal end. Shoot for uprights spaced at about 15 to 20 centimeters apart to provide good channels of light between them. And when you get down to an established structure, all lateral branches are removed, leaving that stub to capture the fruit at the base. And then these upright shoots are going to have to be renewed periodically as they become excessively vigorous or too many lateral shoots. And the best time is to come back at full bloom and stub those to a live bud or two. So this might be a good moment to just take a second and see if there are any questions before I move on. I wanted to finish off now with some of the work we looked at in mechanization and automation in UFO systems.
So I think we've got a couple questions, Matt.
Yeah.
Let me just see here. All right, so is the leaf size smaller in the UFO than in central leader trees? If so, does this translate to a significant difference in nutrient programs and disease management? And the follow-up question to that is, are there any disease concerns with the timing and size of these large renewal cuts that are happening at full bloom?
Okay. In terms of leaf size, no. No, I've never seen any difference in leaf area per spur, leaf size, individual leaf size between architectures. So we haven't seen growers need to modify nutrient plans or nutrient programs to account for that. We've seen a lot of growers shifting to these later fall applications of low biuret urea to try to build up reserves in over winter, so that in this early spring, as those leaves are being formed, that there's plenty of nutrient reserves to support that growth. In some cases, you might see smaller leaves if they've overcropped. That can happen where after a heavy year or even 2 larger crop years, if there hasn't been an adjustment that it's accounted for the larger nutrient removal in the crop, that could be a problem. But generally speaking, no, we don't see a difference in leaf size. And the question then about the disease concerns with the timing of the renewal pruning in the spring. No, in fact, that's actually quite a good time. In fact, it's better than dormant from a disease pressure point of view. You've got positive pressure and sap flow through the tree, and wounds heal very quickly at that time. We don't get dieback like you might from some dormant cuts. And so we found that's worked out very well. In fact, we've even seen that in work that we've done with the UFO in Chile, where they have a lot more pressures even with bacterial canker than we do. And that same story, that full bloom renewal cut turned out to be the best time there too.
Great, thanks, Matt. Yeah, there's a fair amount of bacterial canker pressure in some of the areas too. So that's interesting what you said about Chile there.
Right, yeah, it would be much preferable to do those cuts at full bloom. In fact, you get a better response at full bloom, and it's better timing for bacterial canker at full bloom, we've found. The other trick with putting the pieces of plastic around the wire has also helped too, I think, to reduce canker pressures and wounds in trees.
Excellent. Another question was, is it possible that you'll have too many shoots in the first year of growth? And do you start to space those shoots at the 15 to 20 centimeters apart during the first year?
Definitely. Yeah. That doesn't happen very often, but it is possible. And I have seen that where there were too many shoots in the first year. That was a very high vigor situation. Typically you'd be happy with 3, 4, 5 shoots at the terminal end in the first year. But if you were in a situation where you knew you had too many shoots, more than you would need to have a proper spacing, absolutely remove them as early as you can to emphasize the growth in those remaining shoots. Yeah, we've seen that happen more often in the second leaf, where growers were really aggressive with fertilizer programs. They felt like they didn't get enough breaks in the first year, and so they went actually and scored along that leader and pushed them really hard, and it just, so many new shoots just took off, and they needed to be thinned out for sure. Typically in the first year, the tree's going through that transplant stress and that shock and trying to put out a little bit of new growth, and so I've not seen it other than a couple of times as being an issue in the first year. It's more in the second year you'd have to thin them out.
Also a question, Matt, about rootstocks. Did you want to talk a little bit about what rootstocks you've found to be successful? You mentioned Gisela 12 and mentioned of crimps. What are you working with, and what's looking like a good potential rootstock for future? Yeah,
well, first I began by saying that you shouldn't plant the system unless you were using a Gisela type rootstock, right? That it would be based on higher density, fewer shoots per tree, but a better balance among the shoots. And getting the advantage of the precocity of those rootstocks. And since then, I've changed my mind a little bit with what I've seen around the world, where, you know, growers in Chile are using Colt, in Australia they're using Colt. I've seen them in California using Colt and Mazard, and it's a different reaction, but it can work. If you're using a more vigorous rootstock, I would go back to my comments initially about doing the split of the trees. I've actually seen that work fairly well on even on Colt, where they headed the trees quite low, took those 2 leaders, and actually in this case they crossed them rather than splitting them out, sent them across like so, and then had vertical wood born from there. The rootstock spacing vigor question is actually really complicated. It depends on some knowledge of your site and what your target would be. I've always said that almost irrespective of your training system, you want to shoot for about 45 and 50, 55 centimeters of new growth per new shoot per year. And that becomes a balance then of that single pipeline from the root system coming up and how it's distributed and how uniformly it's distributed. And it's a difficult one to know. If you want the benefits of the precocity, I would absolutely promote and suggest using Gisela rootstocks. Krimsk, we have just a little bit less experience, but it seems like it could be similar. Thinking more about Krimsk 6 than 5. I've seen cases with Gisela 5. In fact, the one that I showed you was our very first block was Gisela 5, planted 6 feet apart down the row. It's done really, really well. It's the oldest one now, and I keep taking people to go and see it because it illustrates so many of the questions that people have. How long can these live? What Gisela 5 is too productive, too dwarfing, and it shows how you can manage that. And I've seen, like I said, I've also seen examples of Mazard and Colt where growers have been able to figure that out too. So I don't really have a list of don't use these rootstocks, you have to use these rootstocks. I think that innovative and creative and savvy growers can make it work almost with any rootstock.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. Are there any other questions that are people have on their minds? I can open the floor here and unmute folks if you would like to ask, or you can certainly type to the chat. Great, and if not, I think we can keep on rolling. Matt, you got a few more slides you wanted to do, so.
Yeah, actually I see that maybe I've gone into more detail than I anticipated that I would if it's 8:15.
Okay.
And yeah, I'll skip over a few here because there's a couple that I wanted to emphasize a bit more than others, and I had a lot of maybe more information than I thought. So we've seen this architecture UFO being configured to both vertical and angled, right? So a Y architecture on the right or the vertical one on the left. Typically, our spacing is 9 to 10 feet between the rows and the vertical. And by the way, we are in those blocks, we are going to 10 plus feet high. We've done some light interception studies and looked at these relationships between row spacing and tree height. And we've seen that you can exceed the 1-to-1 ratio on vertical UFO fruiting walls and still be very productive and not lose the bottoms at all. Angled canopies are also very popular and probably being more popular in the more recent years. And that's because of this simple, I think partly because of this simple math, where your yield potential with uprights per acre, if they're spaced at this 20 centimeter rule, you'd have, you can see the numbers here where an angled canopy just would have greater potential for yield at these row spacings. So I'll skip over the simple question of why mechanization. We've been looking at various timings and ways of incorporating mechanization, including dormant pruning, pre-harvest pruning, post-harvest pruning, all by machine, mechanical thinning. we've worked on mechanical or artificial pollination systems in these fruiting walls. We've also looked at mechanical harvest. I'll just quickly, I'm not sure how well the video will show. Sometimes it works so well over Zoom. But this was actually our very first trial about 12 years ago in a research, this is a third leaf research block with UFO at a research farm, and doing mechanical pruning of just cutting off the lateral wood. Clearly it's fast, it's fairly uniform, it's easy to do. But on the flip side, it's not selective. You can see that it's difficult to get exactly the same distance from the leader. And we had questions in the long run about, which you've already raised yourselves, about disease sensitivities. But our work in here was showing that 3 passes per tree, which is a topping and then hedging on both sides, was 13 times faster than hand pruning. So tremendous efficiencies. In the Y trellis configurations that you see here for UFO, growers are not able to use the machine pruning, and that's one drawback. In fact, one grower that I talked to who did not plant any more Y trellis and went to vertical said that that was the main reason, that they wanted to incorporate mechanical pruning and they couldn't because of the trellis posts and bars. Crop load management was mentioned. This is another UFO block where we were testing the Darwin thinner. It's obviously the same thing. It's quite effective. It's going to knock off flowers, but it's non-selective. We'd much prefer the handheld bloom thinners than this approach. And then I want to just share with you some numbers that we collected on harvest efficiency. And there's all these factors and many more that will influence the speed at which fruit are harvested. And we've looked at these, including the picker and the presence or absence of stems. So I just want to share with you some results on looking at these factors in particular. Because, of course, harvest costs tend to represent about 50% of your annual operating budget. In some cases, actually, it's nearer to 60%, at least in Washington, depending on the block and the fruit. So with a postdoc years ago, we asked this question. We've been talking about canopy architecture all morning, you know, the big old systems. Here's a KGB in the top right, steep leader, UFO, and a central leader. We wanted to know what difference those architectures made on picking speed. And here's the summary of quite a bit of work. We were using the same 4 people, and we went around to commercial orchards of different architectures and had the same people pick, both with buckets and ladders. And here's how it played out. The traditional open center, the average picking speed was about 1 pound per minute. When we went to a steep leader, they were 13% faster. In that central leader architecture, they were now 45% faster than the open center traditional system. KGB was faster still. They were 50% faster. And when they were in a UFO block, they were twice as fast. So this was the first evidence, sort of empirical evidence, to suggest that the benefits that we've been talking about all along of improved labor efficiency are actually true. We had this system in Chile as well, where we did some research down there on picking speed, and that was sort of they had a tunnel system. There was a pedestrian system that wasn't especially fast. Though this is more a reflection, of course, of the pickers that they have in Chile and that aren't as fast. We didn't take those same 4 pickers down to Chile to do the study there. So we used local people. So anyway, if you just compared the traditional open center with the extreme end, which would be, in this case, it was a UFO block, which was not a pedestrian block. It was a mature block with ladders. That's telling you that for the same acreage, you would only require half the pickers, right, to pick it in the same amount of time, or that you could have the same number of pickers and pick it twice as fast. And I think that's a compelling prospect as well. If you think about optimum harvest timings and harvest windows, you could really get the fruit off and out of your block quickly, just when you needed it to be ready. And I'll just share with you also some work that we did that compared the steep leader, which is a very popular system still here, with the UFO. And these are the same 4 pickers. I'm going to show you. So now what I'm showing you is the steep leader in blue and the harvest rate for UFO in green for the same people. Yep. And this happened to be a mother-daughter team, by the way, 44-year-old woman who was an exceptionally good picker, very, very experienced. And this was her a 17-year-old daughter who was not as effective as a picker, and then two others on the same picking team. So when you compare their rate in the steep leader versus the UFO, they all improved in the UFO. They were all faster. Picker 3 wasn't a lot faster, just 15%. Picker 4 had a 40% improvement. The fastest picker overall increased by 62% into the UFO. But the one that changed the most, and this is the important point here, the one that doubled her speed was the younger one, right? So this demographic, we see this aging demographic, I know who are the new people who are going to come in and pick cherries? Well, when you offer them an architecture that's fairly simple and fruit are very accessible, we find that their speeds are really good. In fact, if you look at this 17-year-old was faster than the other two, far more experienced pickers in the UFO. So this I felt was kind of promising, that we're seeing that let's just call it less skilled, less experienced pickers can be quite effective in these architectures. Our overall rate that I use for many calculations I shared earlier is just about at a pound per minute. So if you take a look at the average of lots of different crews that we've looked at, so she's far exceeding that average. And so this is one of the other benefits, longer term benefits of having these simplified architectures where picking speed is faster. By the way, this is a whole nother conversation, but we share these numbers with growers here. I asked them if they changed the pay rate, and only recently have they shared that they do so, right? So on this farm, if you had a steep leader block and that you knew that they were going to be slower, they would get then they move into the UFO block, they wouldn't change the bucket rate. They'd still be getting, $4.25, $4.50, whatever it is per bucket. So pickers are making a lot more money in those types of blocks. I want to share with you another question that we get a lot about: what about tree yield, and what effect does tree yield have on harvest efficiency? And this is what we looked at. We picked individual trees and then extrapolated that out to being a yield per acre, right? And so you can see that from a range of about 2.5 tons per acre, low yield, to 8.5 tons per acre, moderate yield, there was no effect of yield on harvest rate in pounds per minute, which is surprising to a lot of folks. That's one picker, and there's another picker. In fact, would suggest there's even a slight negative relationship. But interesting to find that we found no effect of yield. One area that we know we can improve harvest efficiency is if we work with a variety like Skeena that has a low pedestal fruit retention force and comes off the stems well. And we asked a bunch of guys to go in and pick the trees with stems in the traditional way. And this is the range of tree yield in pounds that we had. And then pick them in the same orchard, pick another set of trees where they just milked the fruit off and they were stem free. And you can see it dramatic, as you'd expect, increase in efficiency by picking the fruit stem free. And we have worked for a long time on these harvest systems and solutions, looking at long-term, fully mechanical harvest of stem-free cherries using a machine something like this, and a shorter-term process where we're using handheld catching frames, as you can see here, with handheld battery-operated shakers. And so both of these processes are underway, and both of these processes yield stem-free cherries, which is a topic again for another day. But here's a couple of innovative growers that were with our early day trials with shake and catch. Obviously very simple catching frames, handheld shaker that reaches up and shakes the branch, and fruit fall from the tree. Here we were using bed sheets and other systems. This has evolved into sort of what we see here. I'm holding this small battery-powered shaker that's very effective. This is our wide-trellised UFO block in the background behind me that has Skeena on Gisela 12. And it's a very flat angle designed actually for the machine, but it works absolutely brilliantly also with these handheld systems. And when we take these systems around and we pick fruit with them, we find a 3 to 4-fold improvement in harvest efficiency. We're upwards of 6 to 7.5 pounds per person per minute. Which is a significant, tremendous improvement. We're actually going out next week to do some more shake and catch harvest in some commercial Skeena blocks as well. also trained to the UFO architecture. In the long run, the UFO architecture in many ways came about with my thoughts on pruning and training for fully mechanical harvest. And this is a picture of our old system. And then the engineer who designed it, Don Peterson, sitting here, not in a UFO architecture, of course, but data that we collected with this system, it suggested you could be in the neighborhood of 75 to 100 pounds per minute. So when we do train these systems, as you see here, Y-trellised UFO, this is the one that I showed you, was planted 1 meter apart a few slides ago, with about 4.5 meters between the rows to an angle of about 55 degrees. Now, when we shake these branches, we're capturing 95% of the fruit and picking it at 100 pounds per minute. So when you look at harvest efficiency, stem on about 1 pound per minute, stem free, you can increase this by about 70%. When you use these handheld shake and catch systems, a tremendous increase in harvest efficiency. But when you switch to a fully mechanical harvest, it's quite radical, the potential harvest efficiencies. Now, a lot of you probably thinking, well, okay, stem-free cherries, damaged fruit perhaps. I won't get into all that. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about those a little bit more. But I'm convinced that this will be a part, at least in Washington State, of our move to the future. And lastly, this question about pedestrian orchard systems. I'm not really a proponent of pedestrian orchard systems because you're giving up too much light in general. And as I mentioned at the beginning, light is fundamental and the most important input. So this is our vision for pedestrian orchard systems: a crew from the ground, a crew from a mobilized platform working on the top. And we've even been seeing this utilized in harvest process. This is a picture that sort of summarizes a lot of things in my research program. It's a commercial early robin Gisela 12 Y-trellised UFO block utilizing platforms for harvest in sweet cherries. And it sort of combines the innovations that we've always hoped would happen with architecture and then the automation then that follows suit and allows great production efficiencies. Okay, rip through that last bit. I want to leave a little bit more time for questions. You've got my email address here. We can be found on Facebook at WSU Stone Fruit Physiology. And one final thing I wanted to mention to you before I open for questions is that next Monday, so less than a week from now, we're organizing a virtual cherry field day. And I'll send this flyer that you see here, I'll send it to Molly for distribution. But we'll be talking about little cherry disease, the WSU breeding program, some of the robotic pruning research we've been involved with. I'm going to be sharing some of the results on harvest efficiency that I just showed you. But the interesting thing is we're going to be broadcasting live from a commercial block of Allen Brothers. They've got a wide-trellised Sweetheart on Mazard. And so we're going to be talking to the growers and managers, asking them questions, and you guys will have an opportunity to connect, watch this live broadcast and ask questions and make comments as well live. So we're kind of excited about testing out that, and that's coming up pretty quickly. So if you guys can make it, it's 10 to 11 a.m. next Monday. Okay, with that, yeah, thanks again, Molly, Dwayne, appreciate the invitation and appreciate your guys' patience. I'm surprised. I've talked a little bit more than I thought I would use up full time here.
Well, that was great, Matt. Thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation to join your tour next week. I'm just going to see if there's any other questions. You're welcome to type into the chat, or you can unmute yourself for questions. I'll give a sec here. And Matt, I'm hoping that you'll also perhaps, you had mentioned to me in the fall that you're developing an online course. And I was hopeful that maybe you would just make a mention of what that might look like going forward.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me. And actually, what I'd like to do is to send you the survey too, Molly, that maybe you could distribute to the grower list. Yeah, so yeah, I'm also working on building what we're calling a Tree Fruit Academy. And this would be an online remote distance learning, all things sustainable tree fruit course. It'll be comprehensive. It'll be a certificate course that'll be housed by the global campus with WSU, which means you could register from anywhere in the world. and go through the various modules and go through the whole process. We expected it would be about a year long, and we're building it to be comprehensive. So the first level of it would be fundamentals of sustainable tree fruit production. And we will be covering things from physiology, anatomy, biology, to genetics, rootstock science, to irrigation, to fertilizers, to pest and disease management, even to mechanization and tools. And so it'll be an online learning process that's combined with 2 to 3 fruit camps where the cohort would come to Washington State for a long weekend, let's say, and I would be organizing a pretty intensive fruit camp. So hands-on learning in the orchards, things like bud counting, hardiness assessments, disease identification, pest identification, sprayer calibrations, all these kinds of things we'll do as hands-on. And so I hope to get that launched maybe towards the end of this year. I've been working on this for about 8 months in earnest, and we're building content right now. So I do have a very short survey that if I could send it to Molly, maybe you could distribute it to the group, because we are still soliciting feedback on what you would prioritize. We could get into things like even human resource management and spreadsheet and budget managements as well. So we really want to hear back from you guys what you think would be the priorities, because it would be open really around the world to participate. So we're hoping that it could be a resource for you and some of your managers and workers into the future as a source for continuing education in tree fruit.
That sounds awesome, Matt. Yeah, I'd be happy to send that out to our list. I think we've got about 50 growers on our listserv here, so that would be excellent. So a couple, I think mainly no questions, just a whole lot of thank yous for the great content today, Matt. People seem to have really enjoyed your presentation, and we were certainly thrilled to be able to have you. So I hope once things open up again, we can invite you up for another visit to the Okanagan and Creston Valleys. So
yeah, that'd be terrific. Yeah, thanks again, and I wish everybody the best of luck for a great harvest this year. Hope everything works out well.
Thanks so much. I think we'll probably stop there. Dwayne, I'll just check in with you. We're pretty much out of time, so unless there's any burning questions on horticulture topics or spray schedules that anyone wants to ask, we'll probably wrap up.
Yeah, I think that's fine, Molly. I think it's probably a good time to end. We've got a bit of sunshine here in Creston right now, and people are probably chomping at the bit to get off the computer and get out to the farm. So we really appreciate your time this morning, Matt, and thanks very much for the step-by-step instructions. It's been really valuable, and it'll be valuable as a recording for us in the future. It's really helpful to have this information. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem at all. My pleasure. And I'm happy to, if you have follow-up questions, you can contact me directly as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And have a great day. Good luck with the rest of your harvest and data collection. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you again next spring. Take care. Goodbye.